Like many of you, I've been a builder for much of my career. Initially, that was building things for the desktop back in the old days. And then a little bit of building things for mobile, and now building things for the cloud. So building sort of internet scale services as a business. And what's been constant across that is the customer journey. Taking someone from skeptic to someone who might be ambivalent, the general meh reaction to a product, to someone who's an outright advocate, someone who loves your product and is willing to actually share it with others because it resonates with them so much and serves a need and helps them out. The subtext of that is, within an organization, how to help an organization align itself to explore that space, to continue to drive forward, and to find the thing that really works well for a customer and satisfies their need and delights them on a daily basis. In the last 5 to 10 years, building things has generally meant building things in the cloud. And the promise of the public cloud was that things that might have taken 8 weeks now can be done in 80 seconds. There's not a lot of bureaucracy. There aren't purchase orders. There aren't hoops to jump through. There's a stable API. I can log into my cloud vendor's console of choice, create infrastructure in the cloud, and immediately start to provision things and start to explore the space and build products that customers love. Within that ecosystem, there's often a rich set of things to take advantage of as well. So it's not just that I have the ability to provision compute very quickly, I have the ability to take advantage of things elsewhere in the cloud. Chase mentioned earlier PBH, which I believe is pointy-haired boss, and part of me has pointy-haired boss tendencies. And what I've found as someone who's both an individual contributor and a leader of teams, I found that our ability to provision things in the cloud rapidly outstrips our ability to manage them. So we create so much complexity, it's extremely difficult for us to manage it as a small team. Now, in a dual role as both someone who's trying to move the business forward and produce products that customers love, it's also that ongoing operational commitment of how do we manage the things that we've built in the cloud. I have rehearsed these slides more than once. And every time I look at this image, I have no idea what that valve does or what the conditions were that gave rise to it. And a lot of times that's how I feel when I come into work. Slack is on fire, everything is going off. I don't know why this service is talking to something else. And there's probably a very good reason for it, but it's not obvious, right? And all I see are sort of the symptoms of that. So this rapid ability to provision things creates an unintentional consequence of interconnectedness that evolves over time. Sometimes that's good. Sometimes we get really cool ideas that no one really had foresight for. And sometimes it's bad because, well, bad things happen. When I stepped back and thought about, well, what happens when that happens? Why do we get into this situation? How do we better control it? And I found that it wasn't because the team lacked desire or skills to kind of manage this complexity. What they really lacked was the time to deal with it. It's just we outstripped our capacity to execute against the things we were provisioning in the cloud. There was just so many things to manage, so many things that developed interconnectedness over time that they quickly outstripped our ability to deal with it. Now, I won't say that my team's group chat emoji has a this is fine icon. But if you ask me after the presentation, I will not deny that we have a this is fine icon that everyone puts in the ops channel. And it's sort of that steady state of everything is in fire, every single day. Maybe the best option is just have a cup of coffee because it'll probably be on fire tomorrow. So while that resonates with me at a very disturbing level, it also is not fine, right? We shouldn't have to go to work and feel like, well, what will burn down today, right? That shouldn't really be an acceptable state of affairs. And I think that's where Servicefull can help us get there using serverless as a technique. I've started to think about, well, how do I organize the team? How do I prioritize our work so that we can actually focus on the things that matter, not kind of deal with this ongoing state of infrastructure inferno. One book that's been really helpful is Making Work Visible. This book came out earlier this year, and it's an introduction to Kanban and the lean development philosophy applied to software delivery. A metaphor that Domenica weaves throughout this book is the notion of time thieves. So we have time, where does it all go? Because it seems like everyone's busy, everyone's on phones, every device is going off, and yet we don't seem to really deliver the results that we want or our customers expect. One of the time thieves that she talks about is unplanned work, which is something we might be able to anticipate, but by its definition is not something we can schedule for. It's work that just shows up, we have to deal with it, and it sort of takes the immediate priority over whatever else we were doing. So from a developer perspective, perhaps the 5 most dreaded words are, I have a quick question, right? And all of a sudden, all of that knowledge that you've accumulated in front of the terminal is all gone. That quick question is probably a quick question, but the impacts are very long lasting. So the work that you've invested to kind of prepare yourself to do the work is all irretrievably lost. From a management perspective, those kinds of things create a lot of instability. It's hard to predict when things will be done. It's hard to know what kind of quality they'll have when they're done. And in general, it creates a lot of sense of uncertainty about where are we and when will we be somewhere else. Things like we deployed something new to staging. There was a schema change. We've now borked the database. All the tests are failing, plus we've lost our test data. Instantly, basically, the team's productivity is lost, and everyone needs to figure out why. And this is something that I won't say happened to us earlier today, but it could have. Actually, it was yesterday. And so the time that we spent, getting in the zone, getting into the flow, understanding how we're going to deliver things, all that time is lost. It's literally stolen away from us. These are all symptoms of too much work in progress. There's just too much stuff to do. Some of it are things that we've created. Some of it are byproducts of these emergent interconnections in the cloud based on our ability to now provision things more quickly. But fundamentally, the team only has so much time, and that's really the hard constraint for what a team can do. How much time and attention do they have on a day-to-day basis? I think serverless is a way to help with this fundamental constraint. I want to stress that this is often a really good outcome in the sense of everyone on the team having excellent intentions, everyone wanting to move the project forward, wanting to chip in, wanting to say, oh, I can do that. But maybe at the time they commit, they don't know what they're committing to. Maybe they don't know what else is going to be lost. Maybe they don't understand the opportunity cost of what they've just committed to. So in aggregate, we don't deliver kind of as a group what we want to deliver, right? Everyone feels like they're overwhelmed, and yet the board that kind of tracks where things are perhaps doesn't show the kind of progress that we're looking for. From a development perspective, we can't get into that ideal state of flow. From a management perspective, we don't know when anything is done, and we don't know how well it's done. So there has to be some sort of way out of this, right? I cannot be the only person who has experienced this. I know there are other companies here as well who have sort of transcended the plane that I find myself on and have reached unicorn status. What kinds of things do they do to their organizational practices, to their software development practices, to make the most they can out of that precious commodity of time and attention? The Accelerate book came out earlier this year as well, which is a distillation of the annual State of DevOps report that Puppet gives every single year. So in this book, what Nicole, Jez, and Gene try to do is identify what do high-performing and low-performing organizations do, what do they look like, and then what kind of practices can we improve upon to move us from low-performing to high-performing. And I want to point out that the things that they suggest for what we can do as individuals and as teams are all capabilities. They stress that it's not a maturity model. It's not a fixed set of things that we can all do. It's an ongoing process at getting better. So we might be able to deploy today once a day, maybe once an hour, maybe once every 5 minutes, once every minute. It's always something that we're trying to get better at. The way that we measure, or the way that they measure organizations, I kind of break down into 2 different axes. These are the metrics that are used to distinguish high-performing from low-performing organizations. And I think they can be broken down in terms of forward-looking things and ongoing responsibilities. So the forward-looking things might be deploy frequency and lead time, which is, I wrote my code, when does it get into production? Or I have an idea, when does it get into production? And given that something is in production, how long is it going to take to fix it? And then when we try to change it, how often does it break? So we sort of have that yin and yang of forward-looking and backward-looking metrics to help identify high-performing and low-performing organizations. There's specific practices we can do to help us move from lower-performing to high-performing. And some of those that they point out are frequent deployments on short-lived branches. So much like coffee and bourbon, small batches delivered frequently tend to taste the best. So we want our code to be very small. We want it to get to production. We want to minimize the delta between current and target state and kind of minimize those deferred integration costs that we see through long-lived feature branches. In general, they suggest 1 day. Perhaps for other kinds of projects, it might be longer for open source, but in general, short branches that see their way to production quickly. Loosely coupled systems, so systems that have well-defined boundaries. We think back to that image of the valve. There clearly was a reason that that was a solution. The more well-defined we can make our systems and we can have explicit handoff points, the better off we are in terms of those groups being able to innovate and evolve independently and kind of explore that space and find the set of features or perhaps lack of features that really resonate with the customer. They do talk about work in progress limits, but they note that those are only really effective combined with shared visualization and feedback loops. It's not enough to just say, team has X capacity, no more than X. Everyone has to sort of understand what that X is, and they have to be able to say, well, perhaps no more, let's push back a little bit, no more in the deploy pipeline. The reason all these are important is that how an organization ships software is how an organization performs. So the better we are at shipping software, the better we are at things like market share, customer satisfaction, and revenue. And ultimately, that's a driver for a lot of the decisions we should be making. It's more than just a correlation. They are explicit in saying software delivery performance predicts organizational performance. And the way that manifests itself is high performers with higher capabilities in terms of software delivery spend more time on planned work, right? They spend more time driving their product forward as opposed to kind of dealing with these ongoing responsibilities. Well, there's a solution, microservices. And I now have given everyone 15 minutes back. We're all done, microservices. As an aside, the microservice team size is typically 2 pizzas. And I am a card-carrying member of the Dairy-Free Association, so I would like to request a cheese-free pizza or perhaps other culinary options such as Thai, Indian, anything else, regardless of the team size. So if we break up our teams into microservice-size teams, regardless of their culinary preference, the intent is that we've unlocked our organizational performance, and therefore we have smaller teams exploring more independently the space so that we can kind of find those features that resonate with the customers and drive the business forward. Sweet. First problem we're going to have is that looks more like a hot pocket size team, right? Where every microservice is its own function. So clearly in the extreme, having a lot of different functions sort of trades development, organizational consolidation for runtime operational complexity where we have sort of a function mesh. That could work in certain circumstances, but it's going to be a challenge to understand exactly what's going on at runtime when those are the microservice boundaries. Regardless of how we carve up our services, and every organization's journey is different to do that because how they arrived at where they are dictates sort of how they have to move forward, there's an opportunity to say, we're going to carve up our organization, create microservices, empower them to move autonomously and evolve in the space independently, and therefore create a richer product offering. Once we have one service, there's a minimum operational commitment. What exactly is required once we start running things in the cloud? When that commitment is met, as new services come online, we're going to have to scale the support for those new services sublinearly. The marginal cost of running new services can't be linear with the cost of running new microservices because it's just not going to be financially sustainable. I have worked with the GeekWire conference organizers to take the next hour to read through every item on this list. No, I haven't done that. This is from a Peter Bourgeon talk at CloudCon 2017 from Sean Treadway, who worked at SoundCloud. And when we have one service in production, what exactly do we need to do for it? Now, this doesn't mean, I certainly won't say that I've done this for every service. I know I haven't. But at least the awareness of what kinds of things do we need to be responsible for once a service goes into production. We'll just take a couple. Databases, take the easy one. Where compliance, GDPR, monitoring, backup, disaster recovery, right? That in and of itself tends to be a bit of a thorny wicket. Secret rotation, thinking back to the kinds of time thieves, secret rotation easily falls into neglected work. It's something that we know we should do, keep secrets fresh. There may not be a way to do it. There may not be a way to understand whether the application can pick it up, whether it has a handshake with another service that has some orchestration. So it easily falls into the neglected work bucket. It doesn't get time allotted to it until the morning you come to work, and it is literally the most important thing to do. Also me. Distributed tracing registry. So uncoupling the organization and moving things to microservices means that that monolith now has to sort of communicate at runtime. So a lot of that communication that was encapsulated in the organization has now been pushed to the runtime execution model in terms of message passing. When the call comes in, or the Slack comes in, or the message, or the Skype, or the Chime, or whatever it is, why is X slow? I don't know. I don't know if X always was slow. I don't even know if X just started to work yesterday. I don't know if it's slow because the person calling me is in go-go and flighted everything is slow. How do I answer those kinds of questions? I don't really have a place to go because I've now taken this sort of logical monolith and split it out into a lot of different microservices, and they all have to coordinate. But that means from a customer perspective, their very simple question of why is X slow is actually a very complicated question from my perspective. And I don't want to do all of this. I really don't. And it's not because I don't find it interesting or because the team isn't motivated. It's just that we don't have enough time to do all of this for every single service in production. What I want us to do is focus on the part of our business that makes us different, not the part of the business that makes us the same. This is sort of the minimum commitment we have, but it's not something that I really want us to do on a daily basis. So I stepped back and I thought, well, is this because we're sort of building in the wrong direction? So there's this metaphor we use, lifting things to the cloud, putting them in containers and moving them to the cloud, right? They're not from the cloud. It sort of reminds me of the Up movie, right? Where the house has balloons on it and it's floating in the clouds. And it's sort of in the clouds, but it looks like it doesn't belong in the clouds, right? We all know that it's not really meant there, and it really wants to be down here literally on localhost. It wants to run here. It wants to have terminals. It wants to have everything here. But when it gets to the cloud, it can pull it off, but it looks a little odd. And I wondered, well, what would it look like if we built with raw cloud materials, things that were born in the cloud, molded in the cloud? What would that look like in terms of our operational responsibility, in terms of the applications we could build, in terms of reducing the amount of toil that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis? Would that free up more time to focus on the things that move the business forward? And that's how I got to Servicefull. And this term is from Patrick Dubois. He worked on the DevOps handbook, among other things. And it's really less about serverless and more about serviceful. So not how, but what. What kinds of things can I build if I adjust maybe the way that I frame my problem to exploit things that are cloud native? The challenge of this is that building things for the cloud is a little bit different. So we've heard much of that this morning already. Donna and Chase both spoke to the need for frameworks and things to kind of help move applications to get them to the cloud, because unlike, say, building them locally, putting them in a box, shipping them to the cloud, they sort of have to be born in the cloud. So there's been a series of tools that have emerged over the past few years to help with that migration. The one I have worked on is Sparta, which is a Go framework for self-deploying AWS microservices. That's a fair amount of buzzword bingo that we'll go into in a little bit. And the primary goal of Sparta is to eliminate configuration. I have spent many too many hours debugging production failures because of a tab character, a misplaced comma, a bracket where a brace should have been. And fundamentally, I want to do as much as I can using the tool set and the standard software development practices that I'm used to for building my application logic, as I want to build my sort of cloud application. I want to express as much as I can in code rather than a little bit of code and then a tremendous amount of configuration. So let's walk through what a simple architecture might look like of a serviceful application. This is going to be a React app, and what it's going to do is fetch a pre-signed S3 URL. Now, in production, you might use something like Cognito or Auth0 to manage authentication. They're rate limiting, but for here, we're just going to keep it simple. That's going to prompt the user to upload an image to an S3 bucket, which will fire off an event. That event will trigger a Lambda function that will send the image to Rekognition for label analysis. Rekognition is an image recognition service that does things like scene detection, object detection, text recognition. The results of that will go back to S3, which will fire another event. That event will trigger another Lambda function that'll go to Poly and ask Poly to synthesize one of the terms that was detected in the image. The results of all that will go back to the bucket, and then the React app will finally get the consolidated results and show everything in the web browser. Along the way, we're going to benefit from some of the operational tooling that I can use that's provided by the cloud vendor, which is AWS Lambda in this case. So X-ray for the why is X slow helps me answer that question for distributed tracing. SSM gives me an opportunity to do dynamic configuration. So if I want to change the voice that Polly uses without deploying, I can use SSM to inject a new voice, and CloudWatch for things like logs and metrics. When all this is done, there'll be a chance for the React app to submit a text comment to another Lambda function that's exposed through API Gateway. That'll go to AWS Comprehend, which is a natural language analysis program to do sentiment analysis. So I'll get an idea of how to go. All right, so I am going to attempt to do this live, and it is going to be live because we're going to go to Reddit Awe. So I did not promise cute dogs, but they are available, and we're going to upload a cute dog. It's also clearly the dog's big day because he's graduating. All right, let's go to the app. So here's the React app. He's the proudest doggo. Excellent. So while that's going on, I will flip back to some of the things that illustrate how Sparta supports this through the code is preferable to configuration. A couple things. Requests and responses are all strongly typed. So you can do things like automatic unmarshalling. You can add struct level tags in Go to make sure that the payload actually complies semantically with what you expect from an inbound request. One of the interesting things about provisioning these cloud native applications is that you need to build infrastructure, which fundamentally is just other kinds of resources, but you don't know what it is until it resolves at deploy time. So Pulumi talks about that. Similar model here, where my business logic needs to understand that that this application depends on a bucket that didn't exist at the time I defined it, but I need to reach out and go get its name because that's the bucket I'm going to provide to the user to upload the image. So I can close over all of my cloud resources in a single deployment operation. Other things that can be expressed as code. The public S3 API Gateway back Lambda function needs privileges to post to this new bucket. So we can add that alongside our business logic. And we can also enable through a Go object model around CloudFormation, we can enable X-ray tracing for distributed tracing the Y is X slow. And finally, we can expose this Lambda function through API gateways, telling API Gateway that it only responds to GET, and it only returns 2 different status codes. The other functions in that architecture need slightly more fine-grained access control, and because we have the ability to sort of consolidate that using standard software development practices, we can start to build up libraries and frameworks and things like that to encapsulate best practices for an organization. So here, we have a function that does bucket get put privileges, and it also requires polysynthesized speech in order to give the asset to poly to synthesize. And finally, this particular function subscribes to objects put in the bucket with a prefix, so we only need one bucket with different prefixes. So here we're going to subscribe this function to objects that are put in that bucket. When all that's done, we hand everything off to Sparta. Sparta does the work of cross-compiling the application, packaging everything, moving everything up into the cloud, creating the CloudFormation template, and all the other ancillary resources that we need to make this serviceful application. And assuming, yes. So our happy pupper who graduated today is in fact an animal, a canine, and a husky, and so on and so forth. So those were the labels extracted from the image that was placed on S3 that we sent to recognition. We then sent one of the terms to Polly, which hopefully will read it.
It appears that this image includes pet. It appears that this image includes pet.
That's true. Okay, so double confidence on the pet. Yes, it does include pet. And, well, the dog is cute. The reading has a stutter. So what kind of feedback would we get from that? That takes natural language input, sends it off to Comprehend to get sentiment analysis. And at scale, you can kind of understand from customer feedback, how do people feel about this service, right, in the aggregate? So from a serviceful perspective, this is one deployment operation. Because Go has the ability to call other commands as part of the compilation phase, we actually built our React.js app as part of the deployment. which means that things like styling, tree shaking, package vulnerabilities in React can all be used as blockers for deployment. And the overall deploy is 2 minutes. So in 2 minutes, we were able to effectively compose about 10 AWS services using state-of-the-art offerings of managed services in the cloud. And the payoff is at 750 lines of business code. There's a fair amount of framework underneath that, but fundamentally the amount that I needed to do to build this kind of composed application is relatively small. And thinking back to the accelerate characteristics for successful and high-performing organizations, small code delivered frequently, well, there's not that much code that we need to get out to production. There's a tremendous landscape of managed services available that you can compose with. This is just a sampling. Globally distributed databases, Cloud Functions, Firebase for mobile, and in the Northwest, IOPipe for observability, Stackery for observability, Auth0 for authentication, and Algorithmia for AI. So the idea of pulling in all these services and building service-full application using serverless approaches is extremely powerful. And people are already doing this in production. This is just a taste of the kinds of organizations that are currently doing this in production. These are all deep links to user case studies talking about the kinds of things they were able to build and how quickly they were able to build them with all the sort of fault-tolerant and resiliency characteristics we've seen earlier today. So what are the takeaways of servicefulness? Almost by definition, we get loose coupling. Loose coupling was a characteristic of high-performing organizations, and almost by definition, we have loose coupling because serverless encourages an event-based decomposition of the problem, right? It's very clear what my functions are responsible for, what a managed service is responsible for. Big one, unplanned work. So a lot of those operational responsibilities that my team alone would have had to shoulder is now distributed to the various cloud providers that we're working with. So things like distributed tracing, things like operational support, right? There is definitely an opportunity to supplement those with more targeted, more expressive, more featureful options, but at a minimum, there's coverage, which, at least in my case, has not always been true for some of the services that have been in production. And one thing I didn't talk about that much was financial transparency. So the ability to sort of target for a particular customer request, how expensive is it, is something that we didn't really have before, right? Because if we would deliver either containers or VMs, there was a lot of competing resources to satisfy a particular request. So it was hard to itemize, this request costs this much. Much more financial transparency with Lambda execution model. All of these are available at the Servicefull Hotel. I would encourage you all to visit. There's a wonderful chaise lounge out there. The clouds are right outside. There are no walls. They waft in. There's an end table there. I would encourage everyone to enjoy an adult beverage. And if you so feel moved by the environment, to build something serviceful or build something awesome while you're there. Thank you.